In this final segment, I'd like to go over the concepts related to the cardinal planes of the human body. The reason we need to understand these planes are when the human body moves, it moves within a three-dimensional space. And to be able to describe that motion and in what direction the motion occurs, we need to understand anatomical planes. So planes are these imaginary flat surfaces that pass through the body that, for instance, divide our body into left and right halves, or front and back halves, and so on. When we move, we typically move within one or multiple planes. Often we don't just move like a robot in these strict planes, but it is important to note how much they move in each of these planes so that we can describe motion in a three-dimensional way. The three planes are listed here, and they include the sagittal plane, which divides the body into left and right, the frontal or coronal plane, which divides the body into front and back portions, and the transverse or horizontal plane, which divides the body into upper and lower portions. We're going to see examples of each of these on the future slides, so don't worry about understanding them yet. Anything else that doesn't move in these planes, these three cardinal planes, is considered to be moving in what's called an oblique plane. So any other plane, any of these diagonal sections of the body would be considered oblique planes. And in reality, the human body typically does not move just in these cardinal planes, but in oblique planes. So the reason we need to understand the planes is that's how we describe motion. We'll say that the elbow moves in the sagittal plane when it flexes and extends. So we need to know these planes because we want to be able to describe motions or motions that are available at different joints, or the type of motion that occurs when we are doing a complex motion like gait or running or throwing, etc. So when we are describing motion, which we'll be doing a lot in this whole series and in these courses, you need to name the part of the body that moves, and then we need to name the joint that moves, and we need to refer to how it moves in relation to the anatomical position. So what do I mean by that? First off, we have to name the part that moves. So typically you'll say something like the forearm flexes. That tells us that the forearm is moving. Flexion is a motion that occurs in the sagittal plane. We may use a term like the femur moves posteriorly, which means, again, this is the part of the body that moves, and it tells us what direction that part is moving. What this first portion doesn't do, it doesn't tell us directly what joint is moving. Generally, if we're flexing the forearm, I can probably assume it's the elbow that's moving. And if the femur is moving posteriorly, I can probably assume that means that the hip is moving. But it's helpful if we not only name the part of the body that moves, but we name the joint that moves. That makes it more clear. So the elbow flexes, resulting in forearm moving, is a great way to include both of those parts. So we always want to be very clear when we're describing motion and include an idea or the concept of what part of the body is moving and what joint is allowing that part of the body to move. We also often refer to the joint motions in terms of anatomical position. So elbow flexion is thought of as occurring in the sagittal plane, but it doesn't have to, because we could have our elbow in various different positions and therefore allow for elbow flexion and extension to occur in the frontal plane. But because we always refer to things from the anatomical position, elbow flexion is always considered to be a sagittal plane motion for the elbow. Anyway, this will become more clear as we move through these future slides. So the sagittal plane, as I said, is this imaginary plane that divides the body into left and right halves. So the sagittal plane is used to describe motion that occurs where the body part moves parallel to the sagittal plane. So any motion, of her moving her arm forward and backward, flexing and extending her elbow, would occur parallel to this sagittal plane. So the sagittal plane divides the body into left and right portions, and therefore sagittal plane motions would include elbow flexion and extension, shoulder flexion and extension, knee flexion and extension. So those are motions where primarily the joint or the parts that are moving parallel to that plane. As you can see, flexion and extension is a common term used for sagittal plane movement. The frontal plane often is also called the coronal plane. Unfortunately, it's one of those things you need to know both of them, because some books will refer to it as frontal plane motion, some coronal plane motion. But the frontal or coronal plane divides the body into anterior and posterior portions. So motions that occur that are parallel to this plane typically are abduction and adduction movements toward and away from the midline. And they include such motions such as shoulder abduction and adduction, hip abduction and adduction, or spreading the fingers and pulling the fingers back towards the midline. The transverse plane is a plane that divides the body into superior and inferior motions. Most motion here is considered to be rotation of some type. So shoulder internal external rotation, hip internal external rotation, forearm pronation and supination, all are these kind of twisting or rotary motions that occur in the transverse plane. The oblique plane are any abnormal or non-cardinal planes. Remember, we live in a three-dimensional world. That's why we have 3 planes. But any combination of these 3 planes is considered to be an oblique plane. So, a lot of our functional movements, such as throwing, for example, it doesn't occur primarily in one plane. It occurs in an oblique plane because it's a combination of, sagittal, frontal, and transverse plane motion. So nearly any functional movement is actually a combination of these different planes of movement. Now, the planes of the body often are also important when we look at different anatomical pictures, right? So these sectional views of the human body occur in different planes, right? So here we have a picture of the lungs and the heart. We've sliced the body in half, removed the front section to get a cross section of the heart and the lungs. What plane is that here if we separate the body into front and back halves, right? That would be a frontal or a coronal plane section. What section is this, or what plane has this section occurred in? Right? This would be a sagittal plane section because we've divided the body into left and right halves, and we've removed the left half of the body so that we can get an internal look at the female reproductive system, the urinary system, and so on. And in this case, we've sliced the head in half. We could see the eyes, parts of the brain, brainstem, etc. And to get this view, this would be a transverse plane section. Right. So when you look at these anatomical pictures where we have kind of sliced the body in half and we look at some aspect of the anatomy, those are sections as well that are taken in these cardinal planes. You don't see a lot of oblique plane sections. They're harder to sort of understand, but you do at times. So this series of presentations, what have we learned? We've learned some of the different regional terms for the body, including the brachium, the antebrachium, and so on. We've learned directional terms, anterior, posterior, superior, and I would really encourage you to get in the habit of using these terms throughout your day when you're describing motion, when you're telling people how to move, etc. We've learned movement terms, including flexion, abduction, rotation, and how those terms often indicate what plane of motion or plane of the body the motion is occurring within. And then finally, we've learned some of the different planes of the human body, the 3 planes, the 3 cardinal planes of the human body, and then the kind of catch-all oblique plane that's any combination of those 3. Well, thank you for watching this series of presentations. In the next series, we're going to consider muscle function and action and how it helps to power movement and the different types of muscle actions that can occur when we are moving the human body.